Here we are for part two of selling points for older homes. Welcome, David Schiff. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
So, David, I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Well, I just want to mention, in case anybody doesn't know, that the first part of this is now posted on the Green Team Facebook page. And thanks for taking care of that, Jeff. I appreciate it. And in that part, we talked a bit about surprising ways in which old houses can be more energy efficient than new ones. And we talked about why replacing old windows can be a bad idea. And we discussed when water in the basement is actually not a big deal. Today's topics will include some of the great irreplaceable features you'll find in old houses that you never see in new homes. And after that, we'll cover some fun and simple detective work that will help you date an older home. In that particular part, I'll be throwing a bunch of dates at you, but if you're interested in referring back to any of that, I'm in the process of publishing all of that in the form of blogs on my website, Iron Mountain Home Inspection, so you can look there for any facts and figures that you might want to pick up. Once again, before I get started, I wanted to thank Green Agent Pip Klein for suggesting that I do these meetings. Okay, so let's get started with irreplaceable features. Basically, we're talking about like wide pine, plank pumpkin pine floors, beautiful Victorian moldings, and many other details, both large and small. These are the features that old house lovers really treasure. There are, I think, two main reasons that some of the best features of old houses aren't found in new homes. The first reason is that highly skilled craftsmen have become rare and extremely expensive. There was once a rigorous apprenticeship system, and that's now a thing of the past. And house construction materials have become increasingly modular. They're designed to be installed without much skill. And the other reason is that the wealth of high quality old growth timber that this continent once was blessed with is now gone. So let's start with floors. And now I will share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. Now, nothing really adds to the charm of an old home, quite like the pronounced grain and green patterns on the warm orange color of those wide plank floors we often refer to as pumpkin pine. These floors typically were milled from old growth longleaf pine. I talked about this wood a little more in the first meeting. The photo on the right here shows longleaf pine on top there with a piece of the typical featureless, quickly grown pine you'll find at a lumberyard. Appearance aside, new pine is just too soft to wear well as flooring. Today, old growth pine is only available as reclaimed wood that's more costly than the most effective hardwoods. You'll only find reclaimed wood used for flooring in very high-end homes. And just as an aside, there are two ways that wood is reclaimed. One way, as you might guess, is by salvaging it from old buildings. The other is by harvesting sinker logs from river bottoms. Before railroads, logs were transported by floating down rivers. In the process, some logs sunk. Because the logs were not exposed to air, they were preserved, waiting 120 or more years to be harvested. Of course, harvesting these sinker logs involves scuba divers and specially equipped boats. So you can imagine why this wood is so costly. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, let's move on. Yes.
Real quick, I want to share a funny story that relates to sinker logs. So back in college, I went to college at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire, and one late winter, early spring, my buddies and I went camping up into Maine, up into the Allagash territory, and it was a logging territory. So we brought a canoe with us, and we were, drinking beer and some whiskey and stuff like that. We went out at night onto the canoe, and logs were like coming down. you know, so we were like dodging in and out of,
Wow.
you know, logs on the river. And that was my first experience of seeing how these loggers actually do it. They literally throw the logs into the river and they float down to the mill and they pick them up, you know, 10 miles down the river or
So they're
something
still
like
doing
that.
it
So,
there. That's great. Yeah.
yes. Well, that, you know, that was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, not to date myself, but that was about 20 years ago. And so but I didn't know that this whole sinker log thing happened. That's interesting. You know,
Yeah.
that's an interesting
And, you know,
fact.
and because they're in the mud and there's no air, they're preserved. And
Right.
actually, those tend to be some of the best logs of their era because they were heavier and denser. That's why they sunk. They had more resin, so they're more rot resistant even than other contemporary wood of their time. So,
Right. I'm just
and,
glad one of the logs didn't hit our canoe and made us a
oh,
sinker human, you know, at the bottom of the
uh-oh.
river. So
Well, I hope you didn't need scuba divers to rescue you.
whiskey
Um,
doesn't always give you the best
Judgment.
decisions.
Okay, that's a great story. So now let's talk a little bit about moldings at this point. Um, until well into the 20th century, beautiful moldings were an important status symbol and selling point for a house. And not so much now, of course. Many high-end new homes don't even have casings around the windows and doors. Now, I'd love to hear what you guys think about this because I'm just guessing. But I think that one reason for this, or an important reason for this, is that buyers of new homes tend to be more focused on lots of space and on amenities, stuff like master baths with jacuzzi tubs and the latest and greatest kitchen appliances. Since that stuff didn't exist in earlier centuries, builders focused more on making houses, you know, just beautiful, since they didn't have those other things to sell. And I just wonder what you guys think about that, you know, in your experience. Does that make sense? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Quiet group today. Okay. Um, you know, and the moldings that you do see are almost always painted. You know, rarely do you see clear coated hardwoods anymore. That kind of wood is just too expensive, except for high-end homes. Most of today's molding stock is made of finger jointed scraps of pine, or increasingly you'll see PVC or other plastics. Truthfully, the plastic moldings are actually superior to new painted wood. Plastic is more stable and uniform, and it doesn't warp and joints don't open up like new growth pine.
Hey, David, I don't know if you're intending to screen share, but right now you are not. Just a
Oh,
heads up.
okay. No, not quite yet. I will in a
Okay,
second.
sounds good.
I want you to enjoy my beautiful face for a moment or two here. But for lovers of old houses, moldings are still a big selling point. And if the molding sports an original clear finish, that's a big plus. So now I am going to share with you. Okay.
While David's getting his screen share going, one thing that pops into my mind as we talk about moldings and millwork and everything, I don't know if any of you are watching The Crown. It's a series on Netflix. It's about the British royal family. And a lot of the scenes take place in Buckingham Palace and all these. I mean, it is amazing to look at the moldings and the millwork in those sorts of buildings. Oh my gosh.
Right.
So if you're a fan of that sort of thing, check out that Netflix series.
Cool. Now, one thing I'm noticing here, Jeff, is that at the right of my screen, covering the slide, is you know, other people's faces and my face. That's not a problem for me, but is it interfering with you seeing the
No,
slide?
not at all.
Okay.
You're good to
Okay.
go.
All right. Good. Okay.
I wanted
Yeah.
one thing I've noticed, and it's true about a lot of details in homes. I think people nowadays are not trained to pay attention to those types of detail. So if you ask someone, you know, and when I've talked to clients and I've said, you know, what do you think of this? And they'll give me a vague answer, or they say, well, we like it. Well, why do you like it? And it takes a while for them to realize that something as subtle as the molding actually lends something to the space itself. And people aren't necessarily attuned to paying attention to that. So flat molding, the absence of a nice molding like you're showing versus a flat molding, they don't quite get understand why they like a space or not a space until you begin to point out the subtleties to them.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, what we're looking at here is chestnut molding, and I'm not going to go into all the varieties of woods that were used to create moldings, but I didn't want to mention chestnut because old chestnut moldings are often mistaken for oak because they have, as you can see, it has a similar grain. But chestnut was actually much more popular wood for making moldings, and there's several reasons for this. At one time, about 1 in 4 trees in America, 1 in 4 trees was American chestnut. So it was readily available. It was lightweight, and you could drive finish nails into it, something you can't do with oak and other hardwoods unless you pre-drill every hole. It was also a lot more stable than most other woods, which meant humidity changes wouldn't cause gaps in joints due to wood shrinkage. And of course, it looks great with just a couple of coats of shellac. Tragically, of course, by the 1940s, the species was all but wiped out by the chestnut blight. So if you see unpainted chestnut molding, you have a particularly valuable and irreplaceable feature. Now, not all moldings are wood, of course. Some of the finest moldings installed during the 18th and 19th centuries were plaster. Because it requires a lot of skill and time, plaster moldings were usually quite expensive. As a result, it's always been a status symbol, and except for the very rich, it was reserved for rooms that would receive guests, such as the parlor, and living room. Ornate plaster work ranged from relatively simple ceiling fixture medallions consisting of concentric circles that were formed in place to highly detailed moldings that were cast in molds and applied to the walls, like you see here. And as you can see in this last photo here, plaster could be formed around curved walls, something that's very hard to do with wood. Like other architectural details, plaster and wood moldings changed over the decades and can help date an old house. If you're going to sell old houses, it's a great idea to know a bit about styles and periods, but of course that's a topic for a whole nother meeting. However, if you contact me, I'd be glad to provide you with good sources of information on that. And maybe in the future we can do a meeting just on house periods, styles of houses. By the way, while we're talking about plaster, I should mention that lath and plaster walls have been used for hundreds of years and were the most common interior surface until about World War II. Drywall was actually invented in 1916, but it was virtually ignored by the construction industry until World War II created a domestic shortage. Before that, it was kind of seen as cheap and people didn't really relate to it, and there was plenty of skilled plasterers. But builders began using drywall, especially after World War II, because it could be installed quickly and required less skill. And by the 50s, with a huge housing demand created by the GI Bill, lath and plaster was pretty much a thing of the past. Yeah, and the slightly wavy plaster surface is part of the charm of an old house. Drywall kind of seems sterile by comparison. Also, as anyone who has lived in an old house can tell you, plaster and lath walls are much more soundproof than drywall. So here's just a couple of other details that I really like that that you might find in old houses. One is transom windows. Placing operable windows over interior doors was a great way to allow breezes to circulate throughout the house without sacrificing privacy. They also allow light into rooms, and they remain an asset for houses with central heating and air conditioning because open, they help even out the temperature of the house, or you can close them if there are rooms you don't want to eat or cool. Another feature I really like is pocket shutters. You'll find these in in old masonry houses, particularly old masonry houses tend to have very thick walls, which result in deep window jams. And builders sometimes took advantage of this by installing shutters that folded into the jams. However, sometimes the shutters have so much paint on them, you might not realize that they actually opened and that they have shutters behind them. So if you spot that, that's kind of a cool thing you can point out to people. Okay, let's see here.
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah.
You see a lot of these features that you're speaking about now in the homes that are being put up for renovation in Newburgh.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, when we do inspections for investors in Newburgh, we'll see a lot of these features. A lot of it has been decrepit, or dilapidated over time, but some of them, are still intact. So you see these features, they're there, and it makes, that's what we point out to clients, that this is really, right, if you take the time, will really make a house so beautiful.
And you might be surprised what's behind the paint. A friend of mine gave me a few that were taken out of a brownstone in Brooklyn, and they were encrusted with paint. So I stripped off some of the paint, and I realized that they were made out of beautiful cherry wood. So I actually used a couple of them to make a cabinet, like a nice cabinet. So they're really something to be treasured. So now I want to talk a little bit, we'll move into talking about ways to date an old house. Unless there's any other questions or comments on what we've got so far. Okay. Keep in mind that dating an old house is really an inexact science. Changing in architectural styles and construction methods came to different areas, different times. Typically, they often came to cities before the countryside, just like cities were electrified before the countryside. Same thing with a lot of other features. So it's a matter of time bracketing. We can look at the way the lumber was sawn, how the nails were made, the types of moldings, the architectural style, and other factors, and then we can correlate the time periods during which each element was popular. This way we can narrow down, approximately when a house was built. For now, just to give you an idea, I'll touch on how to date two elements of home construction, lumber and the nails. You can find evidence of these in the exposed framing of the cellar and the attic in a house. As I mentioned in the last meeting, before about 1860, houses were typically timber framed, unless, of course, they were made of solid masonry. Timber frame takes quite a bit of skill. Large timbers are joined with tenons fitted into mortises. So it's like a tongue into a hole. And then a hole was drilled through the joint, and a wooden peg was driven into the hole to lock the two framing members together. Let's go to another slide here. There were three methods of cutting the timber to size. Hand hewing and pit sawing were the most common. The third method, water-powered sawmills, they actually existed in North America as early as 1620, but they were very uncommon. And that was because you needed a swift stream to run the mill. They were water-powered. And you needed enough population to make the mill economically feasible. It wasn't practical to transport big timbers long distances. So unless you had a real local demand, it wasn't used much. Hand hewing was done with a special axe called an adze. Unlike a typical axe, the cutting edge on an adze is perpendicular to the handle. So the worker would straddle the log, and yes, this is as dangerous as it sounds, and then swing the adze towards himself, cutting out a chunk of wood with each blow. That left the marks you see here in this topmost photo. These marks along the way. Now, let's just get over here. Now, rather than the adze marks left by hewing, some early timber frames had straight saw marks across the width of the timber. Now, if you see pairs of marks that cross each other at a slight angle, then the timber was pit sawn, as shown in the bottommost photo here. One man stood in the pit under the timber, and the other stood on top, actually on the timber typically. And together they worked a long two-handed saw back and forth. And they worked in an angle, I imagine, probably just so the sawdust didn't fall right in the bottom guy's face. However, if the marks are straight up and down with regular spacing, like you see in the middle photo there, then the timber was cut on an early water-powered sawmill. These used blades that went straight up and down, as opposed to modern mills, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, as I mentioned, milled lumber was pretty rare before 1860. Then around 1860, steam-powered mills using circular saw blades came on the scene. This made it feasible to slice lumber into smaller pieces, and so stick framing was developed. By the 1880s, stick framing was the mainstream way to build a house. During this period, the advent of railroads made it feasible to ship lumber around the country. There were two types of stick framing. There are two types of stick framing that you might find. Balloon framing was used until the 1930s. This photo we see here shows an early balloon frame, and then platform framing took over and is used to the present day. Now this next slide shows a difference. Now, as you can see here, this is a balloon frame over here, and the studs go from the bottom plate all the way up continuously past the second floor to the rafters. The big problem with this was that in the case of fire, the flames would be quickly sucked up the uninterrupted wall cavities. Platform framing is so named because you start by building a platform for the first floor, and then you build the second story on top of that. Then you build another platform before erecting the second story walls. The second platform acts as a fire stop. It also gave carpenters a secure platform to stand on while putting up the second story walls. And besides that, shorter studs were easier to transport and work with. And of course now, shorter wood is more readily available too. Most of the sticks in stick framing are 2x, which until about 1920 meant they were 2 inches thick. They actually were 2 inches thick. So if you go into the cellar or attic and you find joists or rafters that are a full 2 inches thick, the house likely was built between around 1880 and 1920. In the 20s, most lumber manufacturers began planing lumber to final dimension. So the circular saw marks disappeared and lumber became smoother. They were planing down 2x4s, so the final dimensions were smaller. Originally, they were about 1 3/4 inches thick, and then around 1962, they started reducing it to about 1.5 inches thick today. So that's why today's 2x4s actually measure 1.5 by 3.5 inches. One more thing that's important to know when using lumber marks to date a house is that old hand-hewn beams were quite often reused in newer structures. Usually it's easy to tell. There will be members that are sawn along with the older pieces that are hand-hewn. Plus, you'll usually find unused mortises along the length of the piece. And I am going to show you an example of that from my own house. This picture was taken in my basement, and it shows a mixture of lumber from various eras. To the right, you see 2 hand-hewn beams that are mortised together. Here's one beam here, here's the other, and here is the post that has the tenon that fits into the mortises. And right here is the peg going through. Now, you might think that, now, if you look over here, you see a second post and beam that maybe was, here you could see circular saw marks here on this one. And you might think, well, maybe this was added later for reinforcement. But I didn't really think so because of the, other features in my house. So let's take a look a little bit further. Oops.
Hey, David, real quick before you move away from this particular topic. Mm-hmm. So a lot of homes, not just necessarily older homes, have moisture. Some have flat out water running through the basement, right? And as that relates to the vertical structures, I've always thought it's probably actually better to have wooden posts in damp situations, right? Because metal oxidizes, rust sets in, the metal becomes a little bit decrepit. Your thoughts on that?
Well, as long as the posts don't get wet, and at the bottom of the post don't get wet, they're somehow held up out of where the water does, because it can be a problem if the bottom of the posts, constantly get wet. That can cause rot. Mm-hmm. You have any thoughts on that, Steve? Oh,
of course. The wood posts, the problem with wood posts is they're not dimensionally stable. So
well,
they compress, they move. So to Dave's point, they're also porous. So the best wood posts are up off the floor. They're held above it by something. The problem is if it's held up by a cinder block, cinder blocks can, to some degree, wick up moisture. I mean, we're talking about long periods of time here.
Right.
We're not saying that, next week this is going to happen. But so I've seen it where they're right on the ground and they've been on the ground for 100 years. And by the time we show it to clients, the rot is, it's beginning to soften. Or there's some insect damage. You see frass or fine sawdust around the bases of them.
Right. And again, an old oak member like this is not going to move around nearly as much as new framing.
Right.
And is more durable. So I wanted to show you, just moving along this member here. I wanted to show you another photo. This is that same member. And here's another place where it's supported. And you can see here, it's actually double mortises so that could have gone into either a post or a beam. We don't know what orientation this was in, but here's the hole where the peg went through everything. And there's another hole on the other side. And you can very clearly see the adze marks here. So I wanted to show you that photo. Okay. Now, okay, so any other comments or questions about framing?
I have a question.
I just wanted to give you that little overview.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So in regard to the statement where if on the bottom of a post is damaging, what would be the remedy for that?
Well, it depends on how damaged it is, but posts can be replaced. You can put in a temporary support, jack it a bit, and put a new post in.
Okay. Would it be the same material? I'm sorry,
go ahead.
I said, would it be the same type of post or a more modern post?
Well, typically, I guess it would probably be more contemporary material, because it'd be hard to find, old material like that. And one thing I have seen in some inspections is lolly columns used incorrectly as support. It's supposed to be temporary jack posts. They're left in place, and that's something we call out as inspectors. You'll recognize them because they'll have a piece that actually comes up through it, and they're held with like a rod through a hole. They're just really made to jack up temporarily, and sometimes they're left in place. So that's something to look out for. So
Thank you.
you're welcome. Thank you. Okay, so the last topic here I wanted to chat about was nails. And I want to give you a little history of nails. I'm sorry? Oh, that's somebody. I'm just going to brush the surface here and discuss the three major ways that nails were made. There were more subtle changes that can help you more closely narrow down a house's age. If you're interested, you can find a lot of great information online, or contact me and I can steer you in a direction, towards some materials. Now, hand-forged nails actually date back thousands of years. They were very labor-intensive to make. In fact, it occurs to me, it probably took more blows with a hammer. What am I trying to say? The iron worker's hammer, to make a nail than it probably did to drive one into a building. And of course, you needed a forge. As a result, nails were expensive and very hard to come by in colonial America. In fact, nails were so valuable that unused buildings were sometimes burned down so the nails could be retrieved. The exception to that is the nails that were used to make doors. Early doors consisted of vertical planks held together with horizontal planks, to make a simple door. And the planks were just nailed together. The horizontal was nailed right through to the vertical. The problem was that opening and closing a door would loosen the nails. So what carpenters did was use an overly long nail, and they would actually take a little piece of iron and cinch it around and then hammer it back in, so the edge, so that it was cinched into the door and couldn't move. So of course, a doornail couldn't be reused, and that's where we get the expression "dead as a doornail." Now, hand-forged nails were used until about 1810. They're easy to identify because they're irregular in shape and they have roundish heads. Some have narrow T-shaped heads, or less often L-shaped. They were designed to be driven below the surface as less conspicuous finish nails. Now here's another slide. Now here's the tricky part. From the 1790s to the 1890s, about 100 years, many nails had hand-forged heads attached to a machine-cut body. So it's hard to date them in place just by looking at the heads, when they're driven in. These were called cut nails because their shanks were cut from flat sheets of iron. After the 1890s, machines to create so-called wire nails were developed, and nails got a lot cheaper. Wire nails, which are still used today, of course, have round shanks and nearly perfectly round heads. One thing I want to make you aware of, the interesting thing is that cut nails actually hold better than modern round nails. This is mostly because they're tapered, which creates a wedging action. So machine-made cut nails are still available today. Sometimes they're used in masonry, special hardened ones, and they're also often used to install plank floors, both for kind of an authentic look and because they hold so well. And you can identify them by their smooth, regular square heads. That's really all I have for today. And I want to thank you for joining me. If anybody has any questions or comments on anything. Okay, well, I hope this was somewhat helpful. And if something comes to mind later, just give me a call or drop me an email. And otherwise, thanks for attending and stay safe.
Hey, David, on that note, real quick before we, break out here, why don't you go ahead and release screen share, and then why don't you give us your contact information? Why don't you tell people how to get a hold of you?
Okay.
Jeff,
Okay.
I was just, hi, everybody.
Hi, Pip.
I'm wondering how, I still occasionally get clients who really want the old house, but do other people feel it's on the wane, even though we have such great examples of great old houses here? As a trend, seems like people, if they hear a house is 30 years old, they don't want it. I mean, you know what I mean? Do people feel like, how do people feel like there's that interest still? I mean, there's always going to be those people who really want history in a house, kind of, but
You know,
I'm
Pip,
wondering
I'm
if
just
it's,
kind of being silent because I want to see if other people pipe up. But me personally, look, I'm not out there running around with lots of buyers right now, and I haven't for, a couple of years. But, I still have friends that are buying things in different places around the country. And I think what it comes down to is the location. Like if you want to live in the village of Warwick, you'd love one of the older charming homes that's, the Capes or the Colonials or, that have all the moldings and everything that we're talking about. I think there's a high desire for those types of homes in that particular location. But I think, where it becomes a little bit more tricky is you get out into the country, you have these old farmhouses, they're out in the middle of nowhere. Those are tough, and they need a lot of work. I think anything that needs a lot of work is, whether it's a house that's 15 years old or 150 years old, a lot of people don't want them. They don't have the wherewithal. They don't know how to do it. They don't have the money to get it done. They don't have the time, so I think a lot of it comes down to condition and location. That's my opinion.
So an old house that's in really good shape is very appealing.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I grew up in an 1865 farmhouse, and it was a lot of work, and still is. My mom still lives there, and I kind of like my house that was built in the late 80s. It's really easy to maintain and fix and stuff like that. So, I'm not so sure that I would go back and buy an 1865 farmhouse, but they certainly have their charm. I mean, they're amazing places,
Yeah, it's funny because I have a daughter probably around your age or so who moved to Warwick a couple of years ago, and the last thing she wanted, was an old house. She bought one about 10 years old and very happy with that. In excellent condition. So
yeah, I like to visit them and stay in them as B&Bs.
right.
everybody's seen the, I had the great opportunity because I went to high school with her, of selling the 2 Hathorne properties, off 94. Yeah. And I'll tell you, that was a real dive headfirst into history on 2 levels. I mean, the big house, 1773, in the brick on the side. I mean, but that house had been actually more compromised over the decades because they tried to renovate here and there. And it was, although there were great details inside, there was the structure. I mean, the structure was there on the outside. But the other house that's now called the Warwick White House, and boy, yeah. Nicky G brought the best buyer because he had the pockets to do it. But that house was from 1760 and still had the original door inside and all kinds of, But I remember in showing that property, here comes my cat, Wally. In showing that house, there was one buyer. They brought in an engineer. They went down in the basement. And they felt, it was going to be compromised. It's so hard to. I don't know. It's tough. You have to, but luckily I lucked out on that one.
Yeah.
Also, Holstown, though, remember?
The person renovating the Hathorne house and the White House, they are really doing a tremendous job. They should be, and they have been. They've been awarded and thanked by many people around Warwick, and they really salvaged 2 fantastic properties in the heart of Warwick that are very beautiful. And it's made our town that much more beautiful, And
and
it's just nice to see people doing renovations, and putting the time and the money in.
The backstory was, though, that you may not know, the town of Warwick wanted the big house they were going to make it a museum and, welcome center.
They never would have been able to do what this guy's done.
No, that was, and money, it came down to money, anyway, just thought
Thanks, Pip. Well, you asked for my info.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
It's David Schiff, of course, is my name, and my email is david@ironmountainhomeinspections.com. And my website is ironmountainhomeinspections.com. And my phone number is 845-987-6644.
Okay, great. David, thanks a million. That was a great job. Thanks for rounding out part 2 for us.